I'm sure that's true. Oh no, I thought you meant no one likes to listen to me.
No.
No one likes to listen to themselves. I took it because I'm like, yeah, I probably is.
You had no backlash to that. You were just like, yeah.
Okay, so what can I say instead of so? Would you please tell me something that you learned from this chapter?
Can't do it.
Well, I don't think that's what I wanted you to get out. What's something you learned? Something that you think is usable in your letter? Yes, right.
I guess I kind of find it interesting how like people there's not enough evidence, like historical evidence or anything like that, but like there is, and like same with other things like giving the violent language of us, like the time of Greek or Roman. We have history about that, but like there's not that much of it.
Right. So you take other ancient history, and everybody's like, yeah, there's a Julius Caesar. Yeah, there's that, and Homer wrote this, but then when it comes to the Bible, you can't believe that. You can't. So what are some things about the Bible? Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say I was trying to find it like something like he was like you have to like look at the Bible in this perspective because some of it like might not seem what it's saying like how we do it here like see like a deeper meaning to it, not just what it says on the top. I just thought that was like interesting. There's how like it's like you have to use a different perspective when you're reading it. You can't really just have like a straightforward like how we have it now.
And we look through it with 21st century glasses, right? But you can't with any sort of ancient literature. You have to kind of put yourself in the place and understand what words meant and what were the customs and how would have a first century person looked at this. So yeah, that's true. So what did you learn about um, trusting the Bible historically? In other words, some people say that it's legend. How do we know it's not legend? Yes.
Lists of names that are
So for one thing, the only way a legend can become a legend is if everyone who observed it or everyone who was alive and probably their parents and their grandparents have to all be dead before a legend will be believed. Because there are too many people around that would say, no, that didn't happen. And in this case, what did you learn about the timing of the writing of the New Testament?
Like they were like separated but not like a far amount, but like they were written like the same, like accurately like
Yeah, they were written accurately, but how late, how long after the it's like a little bouncy boy song. That's why it's his he's a little bouncy boy. Did you see his name out there? Did we see his name out there on the poster? Yeah, he was our first 12 sport athlete. 3 sports a year for 4 years. So, what did you learn about how soon after Jesus these books were written? And I'm thinking the Gospels, but also the epistles. the writings of Paul primarily, but also of Luke and of Peter and of James. Fine, Janelle.
We found that was like 15 to 25 years after his death, and like said that people would still be like living.
Right, right. It's possible that the Gospel of Mark was written less than even 15 years. And a lot of the books that we read, we know were written before AD 70. How do we know they were written before AD 70? Because in AD 70, the Romans leveled the temple. And Jesus talks about that happening in the Gospels. And that's what some people say, well, it must have already happened, because how could he know that? But we have ample proof. And we'll watch some videos, you'll have ample understanding of how those writings came to be and when those writings came to be. And we know from historical record that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark. His name was John Mark. I love John Mark's story. John Mark went on the first missionary trip of Paul and Barnabas, but he got cold feet and he turned around and he went home. He ditched them. And so the next time Paul and Barnabas are getting ready to go out on a missionary trip, Barnabas says, let's take John Mark. And Paul's like, nope, he ditched us. I can't take that. I can't take someone that's not going to stay the course. And so they had an argument. This tells us this in Acts. These two huge leaders of the church are having an argument, and so they split. And Paul took, I think, Timothy, I think, and Barnabas took John Mark. And two things about that. One is that caused the gospel to go farther, right? Because they both went to separate places. They reached more people because they didn't go together. But then the other part is at the end of Paul's life in 2 Timothy, and if you get a chance, read 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy is the last known thing that Paul wrote. And Paul was a passionate man, but he knows he's about to die. And it's even passionate for Paul's writings. And at the end, he's saying to Timothy, he's writing this to Timothy, he's asking Timothy to bring him some things, bring him his parchments, for they're precious to me. And then he says, and bring John Mark, for he is useful in my ministry. So they were reconciled to one another, and John Mark proved his worth, probably because he wrote Mark. And we know from history that John Mark wrote that down from Peter's recollections. It reads like Peter wrote it. What I think happened, and I'll know this for sure or not, that is true or not when I get to heaven, but that he was right, like Peter was talking to him and he was writing. And one of the reasons is, does anybody remember from sophomore year what the key word was in the book of Mark? The Gospel of Mark? Immediately. And immediately the boat reached the shore, and immediately they got in the boat, and immediately the man left, and immediately, over and over and over again. I think I read in Mark 1, like there's 16 uses of the word immediately, just in the first chapter. And remember, Peter, he was the man of action. He was the one to, act first and think second, right? He's like, you're not going to arrest him, and it reads very much like Peter. So all of the books, the latest books to be written, were the Gospel of John and John's letters. And we know from history that he lived to be a very old man into the very few last years of the first And those books were written in the 90s. Those are the latest, the latest dates for the books of the New Testament. So you had eyewitnesses there, and if they made truth claims like Jesus rose from the dead, like Jesus did miracles, that all of those things that people take issue with in the New Testament, there were eyewitnesses. These were all of those letters, all of those gospels were written either by eyewitnesses or people who were informed by eyewitnesses. By that I mean Luke. Luke was not an eyewitness, but he talked to and he listened to. Then he wrote his gospel, Luke, and the book of Acts off of the recollections of eyewitnesses. Now, the only book of the New Testament that is the outlier is the book of Hebrews, only because we don't know for sure who wrote the book of Hebrews. If you ever read about Hebrews or read a commentary about Hebrews, it always calls the author of Hebrews. We don't know for sure. I remember reading that it couldn't be Paul. And I'm like, oh, come on. How could you? And then I went to teach it. And I'm reading it and I'm studying it. And I'm like, it can't be Paul. It just doesn't read like Paul. But you only know that if you read a lot of Paul and then you go to Hebrews. So there were still people alive that could either corroborate, could all agree with what was being said, or say, no, that's not how it happened. This is how it happened. So they can't be legend because they're too early to be legend. It takes hundreds of years for legend to take hold. So let's play like a little bit of a fictional game. Okay, let's say somebody started a rumor that Mr. Hood was a punk rock star in the 80s when he was, or 90s or whatever it was, that when he was in had pink hair, he had hair. And oh my gosh, that's funny too. So how long would it take for people to actually believe that? Like, would anybody here believe that? They might, but then you go ask his parents. Parents live right down the street. Hey, Mrs. Hood, was he ever? No, he wasn't. And friends from that one of his roommates was here just not too long. We could ask him, hey, was he really a punk rock star? It could take hold because there are too many people who are still alive that went to college with Mr. Hood, right? So that's the case here. There were people that could have refuted what was being written, and I'm sure there were some who did. But the evidence is just too great. That's going to be in. Okay, so the timing is far too early for the Gospels to be legend. What do you know about the standard practice with Scripture in the day of Jesus, in the time of Jesus? Yeah.
That's what the scholars rabbis had.
Most Jewish males had the entire Old Testament committed to memory. So this whole idea of, well, you can't believe it because it was, passed down orally for so long. Well, the Old Testament probably was. But remember, they're in an oral culture. They're not in a written culture. And in oral cultures, we have fantastic capacity for memory. When I taught psychology, by the way, psychology is coming back next year. I'm not teaching it, but I'm just so excited that we're going to be able to offer it. And I would show these videos. What were they called? mind benders or something like that. It was about savants. But there's this guy that you can give him literally any multiplication, uh, addition, subtraction, division um, problem. Any like you can give him very high numbers, and he knows it instantly. And he's how is he able to do that? Our brain's capacity to know and to understand is much greater than what we realize. And so people would have the whole Old Testament committed to them. But even so, with the New Testament, that is not the case. It was written from the beginning. It was never passed down. It was written and then copied. And we'll talk about how was it copied. Well, maybe there are mistakes because it was copied. I'll give you a spoiler alert. Yeah, there were mistakes, but none of them were were none of them would change what we read in our Bibles. It was mostly spelling and uh, other dictation kind of thing, mistakes. So yeah, it's way too early for it to be legend. Um, so let's talk about the Gnostic Gospels. What did you learn about the Gnostic Gospels? What did you learn about the Gnostic Gospels? I asked you to take notes. Yes, Josh. Yeah, they're much later than the Gospels. So those people who say no, there was a power struggle in the Roman Empire uh, and the Jesus people won out. That is completely false. First of all, at the time of the writing of the New Testament books, the church was not even, it wasn't the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't the Catholic Roman Empire. There was no Catholicism when this was being written. So, and when they were being written, you could lose your life for being a Christian. The empire was opposed to Christianity and to Christians, and they were being martyred left and right. So the other part of that is that those Gnostic Gospels were written far later, 100, 200, 300, 400 years after these. So these Gospels, the New Testament books, are far more accurate because they're closer to the events that they took place. When they took place. So I don't know why I read the Da Vinci Code. It made me sick. But it is so far from. It's a novel. It says it's a novel. A historical. It's not even a historical novel because the history is all messed up. It doesn't read like actual history. So what happened, and we'll talk more about this next year, is that those books that were written by either apostles or eyewitnesses, either eyewitnesses and apostles, or being informed by apostles, were recognized as being authoritative almost immediately. In fact, Peter writes that Paul's letters are scripture in 2 Peter. I think it's 2 Peter. They were recognized as scripture very early on, long before there was a Holy Roman Empire. A lot of people like to say that the, the 27 books of the New Testament were chosen by the Council of Nicaea in 325. That is false. No council chose the books. The books chose themselves. The books showed themselves to be true. Now, the next big section is the content is far too counterproductive for the Gospels to be legends. So, what do they mean by that? What's the deal with them being counterproductive? I'll just read this little part here. The working theory of many people today is that the Gospels were written by the leaders of the early church to promote their policies and consolidate their power and build their movement. What's wrong with that? What does history tell us about it? Okay, so they were living in community. They went to the temple. They worshipped. They seemed like good people. What was happening to a lot of them? What? They're getting arrested and they're being martyred. What kind of power is it that they have? The early church was not powerful. The Roman Empire church was powerful, but the early church was not. These people were, in fact, until Pentecost, they were hiding and living in hiding so that they wouldn't be martyred. And James, John's brother James, was martyred very early. Stephen was the first martyr. He was martyred not long after Jesus' resurrection. But then what do we? So what is counterproductive about the early church writings? What is counterproductive? That it's not helpful to them. What? Okay, yeah, the prophecies that are fulfilled are there, but yes, that's not what I'm talking about. If you're trying to get someone, think about, I got a treadmill, and I listen to music while I'm on the treadmill, and the ads all come on, right? The ads call on. This is the one simple thing you could do to lose weight, or if you want to make a lot of money, you can do this one simple thing. And do you think I believe that stuff? No, why don't I believe that stuff? I don't know who they are. I don't know if they're talking, like, I don't even know if they're even telling the truth. They're just trying to make money. And so they're going to tell you something is great so that you'll try it. So um, think about the story of the gospel. If they're trying to convince people that Jesus rose from the dead, what in the story is something they would never tell if they're just trying to get them? Well, that he was seen alive. Yeah, people wouldn't believe that. What? Yeah, but there's things in the story that would offend people, not cause them to believe. Well, Jesus was crucified, and that was an ignominious death. That was a shameful death, that he rose from the dead. That would be hard to believe. Who were the first witnesses? Women. In the first century, if you're making up a story that you want to have people believe, you do not make women the first people to see Jesus alive. Why? They weren't. No, they didn't have any place. They weren't to be believed. They couldn't even to testify in court. They couldn't even testify in court because they weren't good witnesses, according to them. If you're going to try and make up a story that people will believe, you tell them that the Jewish leaders were the first to see Jesus, not the women. That it's counterproductive. The only reason that they would say that women were the first to see Jesus is because women were the first people to see Jesus alive after he died. What is the depiction of the apostles just after? Let's put it this way: when Jesus went to the cross, how many disciples were at the cross? One, John. Everybody else fled. Then when Jesus raised from the dead, and the women came and told them, where were they? Where were the men? The big, strong men. They were hiding. And when the women said, "He's risen. We've seen him," they didn't believe him, and it says in the Bible they thought it was old wives' tales because the women told them. And in the Bible, over and over, it shows us that the disciples were unbelieving, were cowards, were doing silly things. They were hiding. They didn't become who they became until Pentecost. If you're writing a story and you're trying to get people to believe this story, is that how you depict Jesus' followers? No, they're all waiting and they defend themselves and kill the Roman guards, and they wait and say he's going to come out anytime. That's not the story, is it? And so you see over and over again in Scripture these counterproductive narratives that would have been offensive to people or wouldn't have made sense to people. The only reason that they would write that is because that was what happened. And then in the Gnostic Gospels, or let's talk about how it is written. In order for the New Testament and particularly the Gospels to be legend, you would have a completely different sort of story, because legend is written in a completely different way. The New Testament, the Gospels are written like reportage, like you're living something and you're explaining it. And then this happened, and then we went here, and then Jesus said this, and then it doesn't read like legend. It reads like reporting at something that actually happened. And that's the next thing. The next reason is the literary form of the Gospels is too detailed to be legend. So here's what it says there. C.S. Lewis was a world-class literary critic. When reading the Gospels, he noted, "I have been reading poems, romances, vision, literature, legends, and myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know none of them are like this. Of this, the Gospel text, there are only two possible views. Either it's reportage, news reporting, telling what happened, or or else some unknown ancient writer without known predecessors or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of the modern novelistic realistic narrative. There was no kind of genre of writing in ancient times like the Gospels. Um, and so it's impossible that they came up with that. Either they're telling the truth or they came up with a whole fictional genre that wasn't going to be around for another 2,000 to 1,500 years. So it makes sense, even from a literary standpoint, that what they're saying is true. And then the last part of this is it says you can't trust the Bible culturally. What do you think that means? What are they talking about? What were that group of upwardly mobile New Yorkers? What were they saying their problems were with the New Testament?
Was it
It wasn't. It was culturally regressive, right? It's not as hip as we are, and hip is no longer a word, but it was back in the 70s. Yeah. What else?
They didn't agree with the science of this.
Okay, there's some possible, not possible. There's some alleged issues with science. What else? What about women?
This like the idea that women uh, were like kind of like
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of
Yeah, and one of the interesting things in Scripture is you've heard of Priscilla and Aquila, married couple. Priscilla was the wife, and Aquila was the man. Most places, when it refers to Priscilla and Aquila, it refers to them as Priscilla and Aquila, and it was unheard of that you would put the wife's name first. And some scholars think that Priscilla was the more important and the more theologically astute of the two. And it says that Priscilla and Aquila taught Apollos. He had some wanky theology, and they corrected it. They corrected it. I don't think the Bible is nearly as hard on women as some women do. But I digress on that. So what did the book say? What was the advice of Timothy Keller to them? Where like, I can't believe the Bible because it's regressive. What did he say?
teaching.
It might not be teaching what you think it's teaching, but there's a more important one. He says something like, don't dive into those picky things and just throw out the whole Bible because of those picky things. Look at the story of Jesus and of his death and resurrection. And major on the majors. Don't major on the minors. It would be like my saying, I don't believe in the Declaration of Independence. I don't believe that all people have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because the United States hasn't given that to all of its citizens. That doesn't make sense, does it? That belief is separate from that belief and that truth is separate from how we behave, right? It is true even when we haven't lived up to that. And so who Jesus is and Jesus' death and resurrection can be true, and then there can be some things in the Bible that kind of make us like, and there are things in the Bible that we go, what's that about? But I think a lot of times you need to take it in the context. Those things need to be taken in the context and then they can be explained better. Now, I'm going to read one little thing, and we'll be done shortly. By the way, this is your homework to read pages 21 to 24, and answer the emboldened questions. That's due on Monday. At the end, it says a trustworthy Bible or a step for God. If we let our unexamined beliefs undermine our confidence in the Bible, the cost may be greater than we think. If you don't trust the Bible enough to let it challenge you, okay, well, that's okay. Do this for Monday, please.